He stayed in a remote cabin with only his dog. A midnight bark led them to a cave. Hidden for 40 years, they said the mountain buried its secrets for 40 years. But that was before one old German shepherd limped out of the dark, carrying the truth in his breath, and forcing a man who'd given up on life to face the one sound no one else had ever listened to. Evan Brooks had learned to live with silence. Not the peaceful kind people romanticized in postcards, but the heavy, unmoving quiet that settled over the Granite Spine Mountains after dusk. It was the kind of silence that made him hear things he didn't want to remember. His brother's last radio call, the roar of a wildfire closing in, the sound of a life ending too early. Tonight, the silence felt thicker than usual, pressing against the cabin walls like a held breath. Evan sat beside the wood stove, mug of black coffee cooling in his hands, Ranger curled at his feet. The Dutch shepherd hardly slept anymore. He dozed with one ear open, always listening, always ready. Evan envied him for that. Purpose came easier to a dog. Sometime past midnight, the wind shifted. Pine needles rattled across the roof. Ranger's head shot up before Evan even heard the sound. The dog's entire body went rigid, muscles tightening under his brindle coat. Then came a low growl rumbling from deep in his chest. Not fear, not irritation, something else. Evan set the mug down slowly. "What is it, boy?" Ranger didn't look at him. He stared through the cabin wall as if something out there had stepped into his line of duty. Then he barked, one sharp, guttural warning that cracked the night. Evan felt his pulse jump. Ranger only barked like that on structure collapses and burn sites when he'd scented a human in distress. Before Evan could grab his coat, Ranger lunged at the door, pawing hard, barking again, harsher. All right, I'm coming!" The moment Evan unlatched the door, Ranger shot out into the cold. The forest swallowed him whole. Evan cursed under his breath, grabbed a flashlight, and ran after him. The beam bounced along the trail, catching glimpses of Ranger weaving between trees with purpose, not panic. The dog led him uphill, toward the oldest part of the ridge where the ground turned mossy and the rocks grew in strange, fossil-like patterns. Evan's breath fogged in the cold, but Ranger didn't slow. Even after years off rescue duty, his stride remained clean, efficient, deliberate. He was following something real. Ranger suddenly stopped at a limestone outcrop, half hidden behind gnarled brush. Evan could hear him whining softly, claws scraping at the rock. When Evan reached him, Ranger stepped aside just enough for him to see it. A strip of fabric. Small, pale, wedged beneath a slab of stone as if someone had shoved it there with the last of their strength. Evan knelt, fingers numb from more than the cold, and pulled it free. A child's shirt sleeve, blue cotton, the edges frayed, but impossibly clean for something buried in moss and dirt. And there was a faint scent. Antiseptic, not rot. His throat tightened. He knew this impossibility by heart. 2 children had vanished in these mountains 4 decades ago. No remains, no suspects, no closure. The case had haunted Timberline County ever since. Locals called it the Lost Pines Mystery. Evan had read the file a dozen times back when he first moved here, trying to distract himself from his own grief. 40 years. No trace. Until now. Ranger nudged his arm, insisting on eye contact. Evan looked at him, seeing something wild and old in the dog's gaze. Ranger wasn't asking for praise. He was telling him something. Evan lifted the fabric closer. Someone kept this clean. Someone still alive? A branch snapped behind him. Evan turned fast, flashlight slicing the darkness. Nothing moved, but Ranger growled again, pointing his body toward the shadows in a perfect working stance, as if bracing for a target to emerge. Then Evan noticed something he had missed. The moss around the slab wasn't naturally disturbed. It had been peeled back recently. A handprint, small, delicate, was pressed into the dirt. Fresh enough that dew hadn't filled it. Evan froze. It didn't make sense. No child could survive 40 years alone in the woods. But someone had been here. Someone small, someone careful, someone alive long enough to tend this fabric, to keep it from disappearing into the forest completely. Ranger barked once, short and urgent. His FEMA search dog code. Discovery. Not animal. Human-related object. Evan felt the world tilt slightly. Ranger had just pulled him into something far bigger than forgotten folklore. The forest wasn't silent. It was holding its breath. He rose slowly, gripping the flashlight tighter. The mountains around him suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if shifting into a different era. Ranger stayed close to his leg, tail stiff, every nerve awake. Evan whispered, almost afraid of the echo. "Someone's been here recently." Ranger stepped forward again, nose to the ground, and gave a soft, insistent whine. For the first time in years, Evan felt something crack through the numbness in his chest. Not hope, not fear. A summons. He reached down, touched Ranger's shoulder, and exhaled. "Show me, boy." And together, they followed the thread of a mystery that had been buried beneath the granite spine for 40 long, silent years. Ranger stood so still he looked carved out of the darkness itself. His ears pointed toward the ridge, muzzle low, breath sharp and controlled. Then he barked. Once, twice. A pause, then a single clipped bark that reverberated off the limestone. 3 barks. Ranger's old FEMA code. Human-related discovery. Not animal, not debris. Something that mattered. Evan felt the weight of it instantly. That code wasn't a habit. It was muscle memory carved from years of working collapse sites and burn zones. Ranger didn't use it unless he was certain. "All right, boy, show me." Ranger circled back to the slab, paws digging into the soft moss. Evan dropped to his knees beside him and pushed the moss aside with his gloved hands. The ground was colder here, unnaturally so, like something had shielded it from sunlight for years. He cleared another patch and froze. Fingernail marks. Dozens of them. Small, shallow, desperate. Ranger let out a low rumble, leaning his shoulder against Evan's arm, as if urging him to look closer. Evan brushed more dirt away. His stomach tightened. A letter, scratched into the stone. Barely there. Half finished. It looked like an H, or maybe an A. He swallowed. 40 years ago, the missing children's names were Hannah and Lewis Morgan. Both names began with those letters. Ranger paced in a tight circle, sniffing the air, tail stiff like a line drawn across a battlefield. His tension wasn't random. He was triangulating scent and direction, an old search pattern he hadn't used since the wildfire where Evan's brother died. Evan rested a hand on the dog's flank, grounding himself. The vibrations under Ranger's fur told him everything he needed to know. The dog wasn't just alert, he was bracing for more. Evan straightened and glanced toward the tree line. He knew the drill from his years in rescue. When the dog's instincts sharpened like this, it meant the environment wasn't just hiding evidence, it was alive with it. He pulled out his phone, fingers stiff in the cold. Calling Sheriff Lowell would mean paperwork, skepticism, and wasted hours. Ranger didn't have the luxury of waiting, and neither did the truth. So he called one person only. The line clicked. Donna Cole answered with her voice still gravelly from sleep. "You only call this late when something's wrong." Evan didn't bother with a greeting. "I need you up here." "Granite spine. Back ridge behind my cabin. Bring your field kit." A beat of silence. "Is this about the report you mentioned last month? It's about something older, something buried." "Understood. I'm on my way." He ended the call before she could ask questions. Dana was sharp. She'd see everything for herself soon enough. A sudden snap of underbrush cut through the night. Evan whipped around, flashlight raised. Ranger lunged forward, body rigid, barking once with warning in every note. Evan's pulse kicked hard. Someone was out here. He scanned the trees. Nothing moved, no breath of wind, no footfall. The forest had gone unnaturally still. He crouched near the slab again, running his hand across the fingernail marks. Some were deep enough to have broken skin. A few had faint reddish staining where the cold earth hadn't fully absorbed old blood. But beneath the slab's edge, something else caught his eye. A thin groove, not carved but worn, like the rock had been moved back and forth repeatedly over time. Not by a child. By an adult. Someone who had strength left. Ranger stiffened beside him, nose raised. The dog inhaled deeply, chest expanding, then exhaled in a slow whine. Not fear, recognition. Evan stood still. Recognition of what? Ranger stepped forward, then gave a sudden short bark, the same bark he used over the bodies of survivors before rescue crews arrived. The bark that meant someone wasn't far. Not alive and well, but alive enough to sense. Evan felt the back of his neck prickle. He turned slowly towards the ridge. The moon slipped from behind a cloud, lighting the evergreens with a cold silver wash, and in that moment the forest shifted, softly. A shadow moved between two pines, small, human-sized, barefoot. Evan blinked, once, twice, but the figure vanished. Ranger growled, the fur along his spine bristling. He took one step forward but stopped, looking back at Evan as if asking permission. Evan shook his head once. Not yet. He wasn't ready to chase shadows from a 40-year-old disappearance. Not without Dana. Not without gear. But the twist came fast. Ranger nudged Evan's leg, then pressed his paw gently against the moss right beside the scratched letter. A deliberate gesture. Evan frowned. What is it? Ranger lowered his head and sniffed deeply, then lifted his muzzle toward the ridge again. He wasn't pointing at the shadow. He was pointing at the ground. Evan knelt. He peeled back another layer of moss. Plastic. Hard. Slightly warm from whatever body heat had passed over it. He pulled it out. A hair clip. Blue, clean, glossy. There was no earthly reason it should be warm. Someone had dropped it minutes ago, not years. Ranger's instincts hadn't awakened because of old ghosts. They had awakened because something living was nearby, something fragile, scared, and still hiding in the dark. Evan exhaled slowly, the cold biting into his lungs. He closed his hand around the hair clip. We're not dealing with history, are we, boy? Ranger stepped closer, chest pressed to Evan's side, and let out one low, steady growl that vibrated through the ground. No, whatever had happened 40 years ago wasn't over. It had just resurfaced. And Ranger was already standing guard, ready for whatever the mountain decided to reveal next. Sheriff Lowell's office looked the same as it always had. Pine walls, old coffee brewing on a timer, dust settled in corners no deputy bothered to reach. The man himself sat behind the desk, with the posture of someone who'd seen too much and believed very little. Evan placed the evidence bag on the table. Inside, the small blue fragment of fabric lay folded like a secret refusing to stay buried. Beside it, his phone displayed the photos he'd taken of the scratches in the stone. Lowell squinted at them, rubbing at the grey stubble on his jaw. This what you dragged yourself down here for? Ranger paced behind Evan, his nails clicking lightly on the linoleum floor. His body was rigid, tail low but not tucked, gaze locked on the sheriff with unnerving intensity. Evan kept his voice steady. That fabric isn't weathered. It smells like antiseptic, and the scratches match fingernail marks from a human, not an animal. Someone was trying to dig out from under that slab. Lowell sighed. the slow, disappointed kind reserved for people he believed were wasting his time. "Evan, you've been through things most folks can't imagine. No one's blaming you for seeing ghosts where there aren't any." Evan stiffened. "That's not what this is, isn't it?" Lowell leaned back, folding his arms. "You spend too long in isolation up on that ridge, and the mind fills in gaps. Every fallen branch looks like a sign. Every sound becomes a warning." Ranger growled, low, rumbling, protective. Evan rested a hand on the dog's back, but he didn't quiet him. Ranger didn't growl without reason. Lowell nodded towards the dog. "Even he's wound tight. You both need rest. Go home. Warm up. Let it go. Those kids have been gone 40 years. Nothing up there but trees and old stories." Evan's jaw clenched. "Someone was out there last night. Someone small. I saw the shadow. And this clip." He held out the hair clip Ranger had discovered. Lowell barely glanced at it before waving it off. "Probably dropped by hikers before the area closed. That ridge attracts thrill seekers. The forest has been sealed for 4 decades. Evan said quietly. "No hikers, no tourists, not even hunting permits?" Lowell didn't reply. He didn't need to. His expression said it all. Evan took a step back from the desk. "I brought you evidence. You're ignoring it." "I'm trying to keep you from spiraling," Lowell replied gently. "You're a good man. But grief sticks. Sometimes it sticks so hard it rewrites what we think we see." Ranger barked once, sharp, offended. Lowell startled. Evan stared hard at him. "We both know what Ranger's trained to do." He alerted because something was there, something human. Lowell stood, pressing a hand to the desk as if bracing himself. "I'll send a deputy up tomorrow. Quick sweep. Nothing more. And Evan, maybe consider taking a break from the mountains. At least for a while." Evan didn't answer. He simply turned, Ranger following close at his heel, hackles raised the entire walk out of the building. Outside, the wind had shifted cold again, sweeping across the parking lot. Evan opened the truck door and Ranger jumped in, immediately turning to stare back at the sheriff's office as if expecting someone to chase after them. The drive back up Granite Spine was quiet at first. Evan replayed every word, every dismissive look, every subtle way Lowell had pushed the blame back onto him. It had been years since anyone had implied he was unstable. He'd worked hard to rebuild his footing after the wildfire. Ranger had held him together when the guilt threatened to tear through him. He wasn't imagining this. He knew what he saw, and Ranger knew what he smelled. As the truck climbed higher into the forest, Ranger suddenly moved. He leaned toward the passenger window, nostrils flaring, ears snapping forward like he'd heard a silent command. Evan slowed the truck. "What is it, boy?" Ranger whined, a sound so urgent Evan's heart kicked. He pulled onto a narrow shoulder and stepped out. Ranger was already ahead, paws crunching through frosted grass, head low to the ground. He crossed the road with purpose, nose sweeping back and forth in wide arcs. Then he stopped dead. Fresh tire tracks. Deep ones, cut into the mud by a truck heavier than Evan's. No snow inside them, no frost. They were hours old at most. Evan crouched. These weren't park ranger tires, not Forestry Service either. The tread was wrong. Older pattern, maybe even military surplus. Ranger walked the edge of the prints, tracing their path with an intensity Evan had learned to trust more than any human's truth. The tracks didn't come from town. They came from deeper in the forest, straight from the direction of the collapsed mines and sealed caves that had been off-limits since before he was born. Evan felt the first real chill of fear run through him. Someone was up here, someone with a vehicle capable of tackling terrain most people avoided, someone who had no business being near a restricted zone sealed for 40 years. Ranger lifted his head and looked at Evan, eyes bright, unblinking. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. Evan whispered, "Someone else knows." Ranger stepped closer to him, chest against Evan's knee, and gave one sharp, decisive bark. Not discovery, not warning, command, as if saying, "We're not alone up here, and this trail isn't cold." The forest around them felt different now, heavier, watching. Evan straightened, his breath steadying. "We follow it, but not until Dana gets here." Ranger didn't move from his stance. He stayed as a sentinel, guarding the tire tracks, guarding the truth, guarding Evan. For the first time since the wildfire, Evan felt the mountain tighten around him. Not with grief, not with memory, with purpose. Someone had come back to Granite's spine, and Ranger had just blown their cover wide open. Dana arrived just past dawn, her truck rattling up the frost-hardened road like it remembered every mile of Granite's spine. She stepped out with her field kit slung over one shoulder, her breath hanging in the cold. Same sharp eyes, same clipped confidence he remembered from the smoke-jumping days. But when she saw Ranger, her expression softened. He was already there, standing beside the tire tracks Evan had shown him the night before. Not pacing, not sniffing, standing guard. Dana crouched and rubbed Ranger's neck. "He's tense. When was the last time you saw him like this?" Evan swallowed. "The fire. The one my brother didn't walk away from." Dana nodded once, quietly. Then she straightened and scanned the woods. "All right. Show me what we're dealing with." Ranger didn't wait for a command. He took off up the ridge with a purposeful stride, head low, tail stiff, moving as if the mountain itself had called him back, to work. Evan and Dana followed, boots crunching the brittle ground. The ridge narrowed as they climbed. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the faint metallic tang of old rock. Ranger slowed near a cluster of pines, nose twitching. He glanced back at Evan, then slipped between two boulders half swallowed by moss. Dana swept her flashlight toward the base of the rocks. The moss was disturbed, peeled back in clean sections. Someone had handled it with precision, not by accident. Ranger shoved his head toward a curtain of dead branches woven unnaturally tight. Evan stepped forward and pulled at them. The vines came loose with a dry snap. Behind them, a narrow fissure yawned open, barely 2 feet wide. Dana exhaled. Someone hid this. Recently. Ranger stood motionless at the threshold, ears flattened, muscles tense. Evan ducked, poked his head inside, and felt a stale wave of earthy cold wash over him. He raised his flashlight. The beam hit the first stain. Dark, rusted, almost black. Blood. Dried into the dirt in small streaks, like someone had dragged their hand across the stone. Dana walked in behind him, face paling. "That's human, not animal. Look how the pattern falls. They were leaning, maybe collapsing." Ranger stepped deeper, nose brushing the ground. Then he stopped before a small pile of debris. Evan knelt, brushed aside a mound of dust and rotten cloth. Something metallic glinted in the beam. A bracelet, child-sized. Silver-plated and old, but the engraving was still clear. L.M. Evan felt his chest tighten. Lewis Morgan, one of the missing siblings. 10 years old when he vanished. Dana whispered, "That cave collapse in the 70s, the one they sealed. You think this was connected?" Evan turned the bracelet over in his hand. If this belonged to Lewis, then he... Ranger suddenly growled. A deeper, darker sound than before. He backed away from the chamber's far wall, tail lowering, body crouched in defensive instinct. Evan lifted the light. The wall wasn't flat. It bowed slightly inward, and in one spot, the stone was a different color. Lighter. He reached out and touched it. Hollow. Dana stepped beside him. "That isn't natural rock." Evan pressed harder. The panel shifted. Not much, but enough to jolt his pulse. It wasn't a cave-in. Someone had sealed this space intentionally. A false wall. Ranger barked once, sharp, urgent, and the sound echoed through the fissure like a signal bouncing down a tunnel. Dana looked at Evan. If this wasn't collapse, then that old story about the mine sealing itself was never true. Evan finished. Someone closed it. Someone wanted this hidden. A sudden gust of cold air blew through the chamber, extinguishing a dust cloud from the far corner. Evan swung the flashlight toward it. On the ground near the false wall lay an old canvas scrap. A faded government stencil marked the edge. HYI 47. Dana's face drained. HYI, Horizon Youth Initiative. The old rehabilitation program. The one that had all those sealed files. And 3 missing kids, Evan added. Ranger growled again, stepping backward with deliberate precision, his gaze fixed on something Evan couldn't yet see. Then the ground vibrated. Not an earthquake, something softer. A footstep. Dana stiffened. Did you hear that? Evan killed the flashlight. The chamber went black. For a moment they heard nothing but their own breath. Then a faint voice. Barely there. A whisper scraping along the stone. No light. Please. No light. Ranger barked, low but commanding, placing himself between Evan and the direction of the sound. Like he understood the plea. Like he was shielding someone too afraid to be seen. Dana's voice dropped to a whisper. Someone's in there. Behind that wall. Evan felt his heartbeat echoing in his throat. 40 years sealed shut. And someone was alive on the other side, or had been recently enough to fear light. He reached out in the darkness, placed a hand on Ranger's back. The dog didn't move, didn't tremble, didn't falter. He simply waited, ready. Evan whispered into the dark, barely audible. We're here. We hear you. The chamber answered with silence, cold, deep. Waiting. Evan lifted the flashlight again, and the beam danced across the false wall. He saw it now, a small hole at the base, no bigger than a child's hand, and inside it, faint as a memory, the shine of eyes watching them. Dana gasped. Evan froze. Ranger pressed forward, silent and steady. The past hadn't died in Granite's spine. It had been waiting. The chamber stayed silent long after the eyes behind the wall vanished. Evan didn't move. Dana didn't breathe. Ranger didn't blink. The air felt thick, like the mountain itself was deciding what to reveal next. Dana finally exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. Whoever was behind that wall didn't want us seeing them. Evan nodded, eyes still fixed on the hollow seam. They feared the light, which means they've been in the dark a long time. Ranger lowered his head, sniffing along the false wall again, tracing the edges with a precision that made Evan's throat tighten. This wasn't searching, this was confirmation. Ranger already knew what they were standing inside. He barked once, low and firm, then again, then once more. 3 barks, human presence, alive or recently alive. Evan's pulse climbed. Dana steadied herself, pulling out a thermal wand from her kit. She slipped it through the small hole at the base of the wall. The device hummed, then beeped faintly. Heat signature. Weak, but not 0. Ranger whined, pacing once, then returning to the seam with urgency. Evan rested a hand on his flank, grounding himself in the dog's certainty. Ranger didn't just sense presence, he sensed distress. And it wasn't from 40 years ago. Dana stepped back, inhaling sharply. I need to tell you something I should have told you before we crawled in here. Evan turned to her. Dana, what? She hesitated, glancing at the bracelet, in his hand, then at the faint blood stains in the dirt. Back in the 80s, there was a federal program called the Horizon Youth Initiative. Nobody knew exactly what it did. They said it was for rehabilitation. kids sent out here to wilderness camps to build resilience. But the files didn't match the story. Evan felt the temperature drop. You looked into it? Dinah nodded. Years ago, when I was still with the Bureau, Granite Spine had a flagged location, a facility off-record. Some reports hinted that a few kids never returned from their training rotation. Evan stared at the false wall, the heat signature behind it pulsing faintly on the thermal reader. And you're saying this mountain is one of the sites? Dana's voice cracked for the first time, and HYI was shut down after allegations surfaced. But nothing was proven. Everything was sealed. Even to me. Ranger lifted his head sharply. His ears snapped toward the narrow passage branching off to the right. Dana froze. Did you hear something? Evan didn't answer. He already knew Ranger had shifted because something deeper in the cave had moved. A scent, a vibration. A breath of air stirred the dust across the floor. Ranger held the moment for half a heartbeat, then barked with a force that echoed like gunfire. Not warning. Command. Move. Evan swung the flashlight toward the passage. The walls widened the deeper the beam traveled, and at the end of the corridor, barely visible, was a vertical shaft in the stone. Dana's eyes widened. That's ventilation. Artificial. Someone engineered airflow down here. Evan moved closer to inspect it. Metal mesh covered the opening, rusted but intact. Behind it he saw space. A larger chamber. Too large to be natural. This wasn't a cave. It was a bunker. A place built for containment. Ranger bolted ahead, nose low, tail straight. Evan followed fast, heartbeat in his throat. Dana came after him, her light bouncing wildly off jagged stone. Ranger suddenly stopped in the next chamber and growled. His body lowered into a crouch Evan hadn't seen since their field days. Serious. Focused. Evan shone the light ahead. Something metallic lay half buried in dirt. He crouched and brushed the debris away. A rusted cot frame, a torn mattress, a metal shackle bolted into the wall. Dinah covered her mouth. Jesus, they kept someone down here. Ranger moved deeper, toward a cluster of decayed objects. Evan swept the beam over them. A children's book, drawings scratched onto rock walls, and a small tin plate with marks that looked like tally lines. Hundreds of them, 1 line per day, 40 years' worth. Evan felt something crack deep inside him. Dana whispered, "This wasn't a retreat center. This was incarceration." Ranger suddenly jolted toward the far wall, barking hard, tail straight like an arrow. Evan ran after him and saw why. Fresh footprints. Too fresh. Small. Barefoot. Leading deeper into the tunnels. Dana's voice dropped to a terrified murmur. "That's not 40-year-old evidence. That's today." Evan traced the prints with trembling fingers. Someone small and alive had walked through this chamber within hours. Ranger barked again, louder, more insistent. He had found a second passage, partly collapsed, but open enough for a small body to slip through. Evan scanned it with the flashlight. The dirt around the opening was scraped away. Recently. Dana whispered behind him. "They're still in here. Someone survived." Evan didn't move. He stared at the opening, at the darkness beyond, at the scratches on the stone that matched the ones near the slab outside. The mountain hadn't just buried the truth, it had kept it breathing. Ranger nudged Evan's arm, urging him forward. Evan knelt and touched the dog's head. "We follow, but we do it smart." Ranger stepped to the threshold, nose twitching, body trembling with urgency. Then, just as Evan prepared to crawl in, something unexpected happened. A gust of cold air blasted through the fissure. A voice echoed from the dark. A whisper, barely formed. "Please!" Ranger growled, deep and protective. Dana's hand tightened around her flashlight. Evan leaned in, heart pounding. "We're here. Whoever you are, we're here." The mountain didn't answer, but the darkness shifted, alive, waiting. The tunnels narrowed until Evan had to crawl on his elbows. Ranger squeezed close to his side, Dana bringing up the rear. The air grew colder, thinner, heavy with the metallic scent of rusted metal and something older, more human. Ranger paused at a fork in the stone, nose twitching, body locked like a held breath. Then he lunged left, nails scraping rock, letting out a single bark that shook the walls. Evan followed without hesitation. The chamber they entered was larger, ceiling jagged, lit only by the thin beam of Evan's flashlight. In the corner, huddled together beneath ripped blankets and scraps of canvas, were two emaciated figures. Their skin was grey-blue from cold, hair matted to their scalps, eyes sunken but wide awake. Ranger froze, tail stiff, ears standing tall. Not fear, recognition. Evan moved closer, crouching low so he wouldn't spook them. "We're here to help," he said. "My name is Evan. This is Dana. And this is Ranger. He won't hurt you." One of the figures lifted his face. The man looked 50, maybe older, but the boy he used to be still haunted the shape of his eyes. The other twin leaned into him, trembling so violently Evan could feel it across the room. Ranger stepped forward slowly, lowering his head, letting them scent him. His tail moved once, a gentle sway, the kind he reserved only for the hurting. The smaller twin reached out a shaking hand, fingers brushing Ranger's muzzle. A sob cracked from his throat. Evan felt something tear open in his chest. Dana knelt beside him, her voice barely a whisper. "They look like they've been living underground since the cave collapse. But that's impossible. No one can survive this. Long without—" The older twin rasped, voice brittle as dried leaves. "Someone else. He kept us alive." Evan exchanged a look with Dana. "Someone?" The man nodded, eyes flicking toward the far wall, where a narrow shaft disappeared into darkness. "Not him, not Lewis. They took Lewis years ago. But another stayed, watching, feeding us scraps, keeping the dark closed. He never left fully. Never." Dana swallowed hard. "Who?" The twins' answer came out as a whisper of dread. "The man running Horizon. He's still here." Before Evan could ask more, Ranger's entire body snapped forward. He turned abruptly toward the tunnel they'd come through, hackles rising like a storm, breaking across his spine. His growl rolled through the stone, deep, primal, unmistakable. Footsteps echoed, heavy, controlled. Dana stood, drawing her sidearm. "Someone's coming. And that isn't the twins' caretaker." Evan raised his flashlight just as shadows broke into the chamber. A line of tactical lights slashed through the dark, followed by boots and armored vests. The first man to step into the room carried a badge clipped to his belt and a rifle held low in his hands. "Agent Mason Hale." Relief almost hit Evan, but Ranger didn't let it land. He lunged in front of Evan, barking so violently the air shook. Not warning. Threat. Mason stopped, eyes narrowing. "Easy. We're here to assist. Evan Brooks, Dana Cole, we tracked your signal. Stand down. We've got the site secured." Dana didn't lower her gun. Ranger doesn't respond like that unless— Mason cut her off. "I said stand down." The twins began shaking harder. The older one pulled the blanket tighter, whispering something over and over. "Don't let him near us. Don't let him near us." Ranger barked, louder this time, and Evan felt the vibration through his ribs. Evan stepped forward, blocking the twins with his body. "Hale, they know you. Why?" For a single heartbeat, Mason's expression slipped. A flicker of recognition. Of guilt. Then his professional mask returned. "They're confused. They've been trapped for decades. They don't know what they're saying." Dana's voice turned ice cold. "Hale. Your name." It was in the early files, Horizon's internal documents. You were attached to the investigation into the missing kids before the program shut down." Mason didn't move. "And rumors said," Dana continued, "that someone from the investigation never closed the case. Someone kept accessing sealed sites." Ranger's growl deepened. Mason exhaled slowly, then holstered his gun. "You wouldn't understand." Evan stepped forward, anger rising. "Try me." Mason looked at the twins, something hardening in his jaw. The program wasn't meant to harm them. It was supposed to rebuild, re-educate. But the mountain turned into something else, and someone had to preserve the truth, or bury it before the government realized what happened. Dana's eyes widened. "You didn't come here to rescue anyone." "No," Mason said quietly. "I came to finish what should have been finished 40 years ago." He lifted his hand. The agents behind him raised their rifles. Ranger exploded forward, barking so loudly the chamber shook. Evan grabbed his collar, holding him back with everything he had. Dana moved fast, shoving Evan aside as she took aim. "Don't do this," Mason warned. This site was never supposed to be found. Neither were the survivors. The older twin screamed, a raw, tearing sound that made Ranger yelp. Evan stepped in front of them, rage burning through the cold. "You're not erasing anyone." Mason's gaze flicked to his men. "Secure them." Before a single boot moved, Ranger launched. He tore free from Evan's grip and hurled himself at Mason with a force Evan had only ever seen during fire rescues. Mason stumbled backward, rifle clattering to the floor. Shouts erupted. Dana fired a warning shot at the rock ceiling. "Stop! Weapons down!" Dust showered over the chamber. Mason regained his footing, eyes burning with fury. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." Evan squared his shoulders. "Ranger does. And that's enough for me." Mason's last mask slipped. His voice dropped into something dark. "Then you won't walk out of this mountain." A single echoing howl erupted from Ranger, fierce, sharp, full of ancient instinct. The mountain answered with silence, and the war for the truth finally began. The moment Mason stepped back into the shadows, Evan knew the man wasn't retreating. He was circling, hunting. Ranger sensed it too. His hackles rose, his body lowering into that old rescue stance he only used when danger was already in motion. Then a flash. A gunshot cracked through the chamber. Evan barely saw the glint of the muzzle before Ranger launched sideways, slamming into him with full force. The bullet smacked into Ranger's shoulder. The sound wasn't loud. It was soft, sickening, a thud of metal hitting muscle. Ranger yelped. Evan hit the ground hard, breath punched out of him. His ears rang, his vision tunneled. But when he rolled to his side, Ranger was still there, teeth bared, bleeding, still standing between him and the barrel of Mason Hale's weapon. Mason's voice echoed coldly. "Last chance, Brooks. Step aside." Dana answered for him. Not happening. Her shot grazed the rock inches from Mason's head. Mason dove behind a column of stone. The chamber exploded into chaos. Boots scraped. Dust filled the air. Ranger, staggering but determined, moved in front of Evan again, refusing to fall. Evan grabbed him. "Ranger, stay! Stay, boy!" But Ranger wasn't listening. He pressed forward, head low, leading the way out of the chamber toward the branching tunnel where Mason had vanished. Evan understood. Ranger wasn't chasing him. He was herding them, out, away, safe. Dana turned to the twins. "Can you move?" The older one nodded weakly. The younger was barely conscious, but fear gave him strength. Ranger nudged them toward the tunnel entrance before limping ahead. Blood, dripping across the stone floor. Evan swallowed the panic rising in his throat and followed. Mason's footsteps echoed somewhere deep in the tunnel maze, not running blindly, drawing them in. He knew these tunnels. He knew every dead end. Dana whispered, He's leading us to the old collapse. The lower eastern shaft. There's only one exit down there. Evan clenched his jaw. Then we don't let him reach it. But Mason was already ahead, a dark silhouette darting past a spill of boulders. Dana fired again. The shot sparked off stone and lit the tunnel in a burst of white. Mason's voice came back, taunting. You think you can undo 40 years? You think dragging those men into the sun fixes what happened here? This program was bigger than all of us. Evan shouted back, It was abuse, and you helped bury it. Mason laughed. And you think anyone will believe 2 half-dead hermits and a washed-up firefighter living in a shack? Ranger growled. The sound was low, shaking. His legs trembled under him, but he didn't stop moving. Dana touched Evan's arm. If he reaches the lower shaft, he can seal it behind him. We'll lose him. Not if Ranger gets there first. Ranger suddenly veered right, pushing through a narrow split in the tunnel. Evan recognized it. A shortcut. One they hadn't taken on the way in. Evan followed his dog's blood trail, heart clawing at his ribs. Ranger, slow down. You're hurt. Ranger didn't slow. His stride was uneven, but his momentum was unbroken. Ahead, the tunnels opened into the old east shaft. Walls fractured, ceiling unstable, boulders stacked like teeth. Mason stood at the far end, one hand gripping a steel support beam wired to a small explosive charge. He sneered. The mountain can bury its secrets again. Dana raised her gun. Don't. Mason yanked the wire, but he wasn't alone anymore. Ranger burst from the side passage, slamming into Mason's leg before the detonation could trigger. The two collided, Mason stumbling backward into the unstable ridge of stone. The ground roared. A slab of rock cracked free and dropped between them, collapsing the narrow bridge Mason stood on. His scream echoed once before the rubble swallowed him. Dust exploded outward in a choking cloud. Evan ran to Ranger, dropping to his knees beside him. The dog lay still for a moment, chest heaving, eyes half closed. Evan pressed a hand to his wound, voice cracking. Stay with me. Ranger, stay with me. Look at me, boy. Look. Ranger slowly lifted his gaze. His breathing was shallow, but he was conscious. He nudged Evan's wrist with his nose, a quiet, stubborn insistence of life. Dana knelt beside them. He saved us. He chose to take that hit. Evan couldn't speak. He swallowed hard, pressing his forehead to Ranger's. I know, boy, I know. You did good. You're safe now. It took nearly an hour to navigate back out through the tunnels. Dana supported one twin, Evan helped the other. Ranger limped but refused to be carried. Every few steps, he paused, breath trembling, then kept going. When they finally emerged outside, the early dawn light washed over their faces like a blessing. Wind cut across the ridge, cold but clean. The twins squinted against brightness they had not seen in 40 years. One whispered, barely audible, It's real. The sky, it's still here. Ranger collapsed beside Evan in the snow. Evan gathered him gently in his arms, feeling the dog's heartbeat throb steady against his ribs. You're okay, he whispered. I've got you. We're going home. Helicopter blades thundered in the distance. Medical teams and federal responders rushed up the ridge trail, drawn by Dana's beacon signal. But Evan didn't look at them. He looked at Ranger. The dog blinked slowly, tired but proud, chest rising and falling with stubborn strength. Something shifted inside Evan right then. Something that had been frozen since the night he lost his brother in the wildfire. He realized he wasn't just surviving anymore. He wanted to live. Because Ranger wasn't just a dog. He was a reason. And Evan wasn't ready to lose him. Not now. Not ever. The first snow of the new winter drifted across Granite's spine like a soft exhale, settling into the cracks and scars the mountain still carried. A year had passed, but the ridge didn't forget. Neither did Evan. He stood on the porch of the rebuilt cabin, one hand on the railing he'd carved himself, the other resting on the warm fur of the dog lying beside him. Ranger's muzzle had grayed in a slow, dignified way, silver spreading like frost across his face. His eyes were still sharp, still watching the tree line the same way he did the night everything changed. Ranger shifted, joints stiff, but lifted his head as if to say he didn't need help. Evan smiled. Even age couldn't convince Ranger he wasn't invincible. The cave had been sealed months ago by a federal crew, bolted with steel plates and geological mesh. No one talked about the Horizon Youth Initiative anymore. No one wanted to. The courts were still sorting through the wreckage of the past, but for the twins, Cal and Levi Maddox, it had been a long, slow climb back into daylight. They lived in assisted housing now, seeing a trauma counselor 3 times a week. They visited Evan twice. They visited Ranger 5 times. Cal always brought jerky. Levi always brought silence. Ranger loved them both. Evan breathed in the morning cold, the kind that pinched the lungs but cleared the mind. A year ago, this quiet would have felt suffocating, like a weight pressing down on his ribs. Now it felt clean, earned. Behind him, the door creaked open. Serena Alvarez, the park medic who volunteered on weekends, stepped out with 2 mugs of coffee. She had joined Evan's project 6 months prior, drawn in by the idea of a mountain station dedicated to hikers and survivors who came out of the wilderness shaken, lost, or simply needing someone to listen. She handed Evan a mug. "You were up. Early." He nodded. "Old habits, and he's louder than he looks." Serena laughed under her breath. "Ranger doesn't bark anymore." Evan glanced down. Ranger didn't need to. His presence was enough. Over the last year, the cabin had grown into something it was never meant to be. Solar panels, 2 extra bunk rooms, a small weatherproof shed with first aid gear and blankets, a radio tower donated by the county after Sheriff Lowell quietly apologized to Evan for not listening sooner. The cabin wasn't a retreat anymore. It was a refuge. Sometimes hikers stumbled in after getting caught in sudden storms, soaked and shaking. Sometimes veterans stopped by, pulled in by word of mouth that the man in the woods understood silence better than anyone else. Sometimes the Maddox twins came up and sat on the porch without saying a word. They never had to. Evan had found purpose again. Not the loud kind, the kind that grew from steady hands and steady routines. Ranger stirred when a distant crunch sounded from the tree line. Evan watched him closely. Even old and arthritic, Ranger still knew the forest's language better than anyone alive. A figure appeared through the pines, tall, broad-shouldered, bundled in a thick ranger jacket. Evan frowned. "You expecting someone?" Serena shook her head. The man stepped closer, and Evan finally recognized the face beneath the cold. Sheriff Lowell. Older, lines deeper, eyes quieter. Ranger's tail thumped once. Forgiveness came easier to dogs than people. Lowell stopped at the base of the steps. "Morning." Evan nodded. "You looking for someone?" Lowell hesitated, breath fogging in the cold. "Looking for you, actually." Serena stepped back a little, giving space. Lowell continued. "I wanted to thank you. The Maddox brothers. They wrote something for you. And him?" He nodded at Ranger. He handed Evan a small envelope. Just their handwriting on the front. Evan opened it gently. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letter, just a drawing. 2 boys, older now but still unmistakably them, standing under a crooked pine. And in front of them, larger than life, was Ranger. Chest puffed, tail up, eyes bright. At the bottom, 1 sentence. "He barked for us when no one else did." Evan swallowed hard, vision blurring before he could stop it. Lowell shifted awkwardly. "They wanted you to know. That's all." He tipped his hat and walked back into the trees, his silhouette swallowed by snow. Serena glanced at Evan. "You okay?" Evan nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his wrist. Yeah, just unexpected. Ranger nudged his leg, as if reminding him emotions weren't weaknesses. Evan knelt carefully, running a hand down Ranger's back, feeling the warmth of him, the strength still left. "Thanks, boy," Evan murmured, "for everything you didn't let die in the dark." Ranger leaned into him softly. A small gesture, a huge truth. The mountain wind shifted. Not harsh, not warning, more like a song passing through the pines, the kind that carried memories without drowning the present. Serena took a sip of coffee. "You ever think about leaving, going back down to town?" Evan looked out at the valley stretching wide and quiet. The cabins, the trail markers, the sun slowly climbing over the ridge. "No," he said, "not anymore." Because he'd finally learned something the mountain had been trying to teach him for years. Silence wasn't the enemy. Silence was the place where healing finally had room to breathe. Ranger settled beside him, eyelids growing heavy but ears still tuned to every shift in the forest. Even now, he stood guard. Even now, he listened. The wind rustled the porch sign Evan carved by hand, the words catching the morning light. For those the mountain kept waiting. Here you are found. And Ranger, silver-muzzled and steady-hearted, lifted his head at the sound. Still watching, still guarding. The knock came just after noon, sharp and nervous, the kind that didn't belong to hikers or rescue volunteers. Evan stepped onto the porch, wiping wood dust from his hands, and found 4 college kids standing at the foot of the steps. Jackets too thin for mountain weather, cameras hanging from their necks, eyes bright with something between reverence and fear. "You Evan Brooks?" the tallest one asked. Evan nodded. "Depends who's asking. We're from the University of Montana, journalism program. We're doing a feature on the granite spine disappearances. And the rescues? And, well, you." Evan almost laughed. A year ago he would have shut the door right there. But things changed when you opened a place for people who needed some place to land. Word traveled, even when you didn't want it to. Ranger lifted his head from the porch boards, joints stiff but still alert. The kids all paused, whispering to each other, half in awe, half in disbelief. "Is that him?" one girl breathed. "The dog who found the twins? The dog from the cave?" Ranger blinked, unbothered by fame. Evan stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze." Inside, the cabin smelled of pine sap and coffee. Serena had left early that morning, but she'd left the pot full, bless her. The students clumped together near the table, as if unsure whether they were intruding on sacred ground. One finally set up a small recorder. "Mr. Brooks, we wanted to ask about the day you found the first clue. The fabric. The stone." Evan sat across from them, Ranger settling at his boots. His tail made one solid thump against the floor, a sound that grounded the room. "Ask what you came to ask," Evan said. The girl with the recorder cleared her throat. "How did you know something was under that stone after 40 years? What made you stop there?" Evan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed a hand gently on Ranger's back. The dog leaned into him, slow and deliberate, the way older dogs do when they understand the moment. "I didn't know," Evan said finally. He did. The students exchanged looks, waiting for more. There are truths the mountain keeps. Quiet. Evan continued. Some people don't hear them. Some don't want to. But dogs. Ranger hears what we miss. He feels what we overlook. He sensed something was wrong before I could see it. One student scribbled quickly, looking up. Instinct? Training? Evan shook his head. Something deeper. Ranger doesn't bark unless it matters. And that night, he wasn't barking at danger. He was barking at a secret, trying to breathe again. Outside, the wind shifted against the cabin walls, rattling the gutters like an echo of old stories. The students leaned in, captivated. Another student asked, "Did you ever feel like the mountain was pushing you? Or pulling you?" Evan thought of the first night after the rescue. The way Ranger stood on the porch, staring at the ridge as if expecting something else to walk out of the dark. He thought of the two men who had spent half their lives underground, and how the sun had nearly blinded them. "I felt like the mountain had been waiting," Evan said softly. "But it wasn't waiting for me. It was waiting for him." Ranger lifted his muzzle, as if acknowledging the credit. The tall student lowered his camera for a moment. "So what now? After everything? What do you want people to remember?" Evan exhaled slowly, fingers brushing Ranger's fur. The truth sat heavy but gentle inside him, shaped by loss, found again by a dog who never let go of a sound the world ignored. "I want them to remember the quiet," he said. "Not the caves or the man who kept them hidden, not the secrets buried too long. I want them to remember that sometimes the loudest cry for help doesn't come from a person at all." The girl frowned slightly. "Then from what?" Evan smiled, tired but sincere. "From a dog who refuses to stop listening." Silence settled over the room. Not awkward, not heavy. Something still, reverent. Ranger laid his head on Evan's boot, eyes half closed, but ears forward, as if he were guarding the truth itself. The students packed up slowly, reluctant to break whatever had wrapped around them. At the door, the tallest boy hesitated. "Mr. Brooks, can we take a picture of him?" Evan nodded. Only him. They kneeled in the snow outside, cameras clicking while Ranger sat proudly on the porch, silver-muzzled, steady, unshakable. The wind tugged at his fur, and for a moment he looked exactly the way he had the night he led Evan into the dark. A sentinel, a survivor, a witness to the things humans tried to bury. After the students disappeared down the trail, Evan stood beside Ranger, gazing at the line of pines bending in the cold. Ranger leaned against his leg, warm and certain. Evan whispered, "You did that, boy. You gave them something worth telling." Ranger blinked, tail brushing once against the porch. Legacy wasn't measured in headlines or documentaries. Legacy was measured in the way a dog's bark could outlive 40 years of silence. Night settled over granite spine with the kind of quiet that sinks deep into the bones. A soft wind threaded through the pines, carrying the familiar cold scent of snow and stone. Evan sat on the porch steps of the cabin, hands wrapped around a mug gone lukewarm, eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the mountains. Behind him, the cabin glowed with a faint amber light. The place wasn't just his home anymore. It had become something steadier, a sanctuary for anyone who had ever walked out of the woods changed, or walked into them hoping to be. Ranger lay beside him, chest rising slow and heavy. His muzzle had gone silver-white in the last year, a kind of premature age that came from years of service and one bullet that almost took him out of the world. But he remained unmoved by time. A loyal shadow at Evan's side. A sudden shift of wind rustled the treetops. Ranger's ear flicked. Then he lifted his head, eyes narrowing towards the ridge. A single bark broke from him. One sharp, clean note that echoed across the valley. Evan didn't flinch. He knew that sound. It wasn't alarm. Not anymore. It was memory. Ranger lowered his head again, but his gaze stayed locked on the ridgeline, as if acknowledging something only he could sense. A thread of the past woven into the night air. Evan exhaled softly. "You still hear it, don't you, boy? That quiet no one else pays attention to." Ranger blinked, and Evan felt the weight of their shared history settle between them. 40 years of unanswered questions, sealed tunnels, rescued lives, and the truth that almost stayed, buried forever. All because a dog refused to let silence win. A twig snapped near the tree line. Evan stiffened for half a breath, instinct still sharp. But through the darkness, a pair of hikers emerged, laughing quietly, guided down the trail by the new lantern posts he'd installed a month earlier. They waved when they spotted him. "Evening," one called. "You folks doing all right?" Evan asked. "More than all right." The other replied. "Your signs saved us. We took a wrong turn up the west ridge." Evan nodded, watching them disappear toward the service road. Ranger's tail brushed the boards once, a soft approval. "You saved a lot more than hikers," Evan murmured, eyes drifting back to the mountains. "You saved those boys. You saved me." The wind slid across the cabin again. This time it felt warmer, like the mountain itself was breathing easier. Serena stepped out, pulling her jacket tighter. "You coming in soon?" "In a minute," Evan said. She looked down at Ranger. "He's listening again," she whispered. "He does that," Evan replied. Serena smiled knowingly and returned inside, the door clicking shut behind her. The stars slowly emerged overhead, cold and steady. Evan rested a hand on Ranger's back, feeling the familiar strength beneath the graying fur. "We made it through," he whispered. "The mountain kept its secrets long enough, but not forever. Not once you got involved." Ranger adjusted his position, settling his head on Evan's boot. Evan spoke the truth he'd carried for months without saying, out loud. He didn't bark for danger. He barked for the truth buried in the mountain. Ranger's tail tapped the wood in quiet agreement. Evan leaned back, eyes tracing the outline of the ridge. He didn't know what stories would come next. Maybe new hikers would arrive needing help. Maybe the twins would visit again. Maybe the forest had more secrets it wasn't done revealing. But whatever came, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't listening alone. Ranger would always hear first. And somewhere in that truth was the heartbeat of every story worth telling. The mountains breathed, the dog listened, and Evan stayed, for the lost, for the found, for the ones still waiting to be heard. What's your story with a loyal pet? Share it with us. And if you believe in the bond between humans and German shepherds, support our channel. Your voice helps keep these stories alive.